So, welcome everyone. It's a special pleasure today to welcome everyone to the book presentation Red Wave by Joanna Stingray. My name is Joes Siegel. I'm the chief curator of the Wende Museum. And actually the first time that I met with Joanna was when we had our Socialist Flower Power exhibition up about the Soviet hippie communities. There were lots of photos from the Soviet hippies, and one section was dedicated to rock music. And when Joanna visited the museum, to my amazement, she was able to identify every single one of them. That's when we started to keep in touch, and to my great pleasure, I had the opportunity to interview her for our series Cold War Spaces, about the experiences she had in the Soviet Union and about her quite extraordinary life. So today is a book presentation in the form of a conversation between Joanna and Alex Kan, music critic, writer, broadcaster from London, who flew in for the occasion, quite special. And the conversation will be moderated today by Olya Soya, who's standing over there. Olya, yeah, please join us. Yeah. Olya is an art and film critic. Curator, I should say, art and film curator. She organized many film programs internationally, film festivals. She's also the founder of a new social collective. And I can already mention that she will be the guest curator of a very special show, David Bowie in the USSR, that will open in April next year here at the Wende Museum. Yeah. So before I hand it over to Olya, I would like to express my enormous gratitude to Toby Coatson, with us today as well, who generously supported today's event, and also to Michael Libo, who generously funded the travel of Alex Kan from London to the Wende Museum. And with that, Olya, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hughes. Thank you for your kind words, and I'm very much looking forward to working together and to our show next year. Hello, everyone, and thank you for spending your Sunday with us. I think you are in for a really fascinating talk. And before we start our event, I would like to read a short statement. Since it was founded in 2014, my company, The New Social, has been dedicated to exploring the patchwork of diverse identities that form the so-called post-Eastern Bloc and to celebrating the independent voices. We see Russia's war on Ukraine as a war on its identity. It's an imperial desire to swallow a nation's freedom, language and culture, and deny its right to existence. Because of that, we feel that it's more important than ever to create more discussions about cultural identities within the region. Today's event was planned many months ago. Since then, the war in Ukraine has inevitably changed how Russian culture is seen and interpreted, and there have been cancellations of Russian art events across the world. We remain committed and believe in the power of cultural exchange. We stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and the many Russian citizens who deplore the actions of their government, and to continue to support independent artists who voice their dissent. Thank you. Now it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the book presentation Red Wave, an American in Soviet underground. And our conversation today is going to go for about 1 hour. At some point we open the floor for your questions, so please think about something that you want to ask Joanna and Alexander. And Red Wave, an American and Soviet underground book, was published last year by Doppelhaus Books, and I would like to start this conversation with a little short video. It's an interview with Joanna Stingray in Moscow in 1992, and it's going to be followed by a piece done by NBC's Left Field in June 2018, which also aired on the Apple newsfeed. Let's take a look. Video is about 5 minutes long.
А почему ты выбрал именно Советский Союз? Ты вот из Америки могла поехать в Польшу, в Бангладеш, в Австралию, куда угодно. Почему ты именно оказалась здесь?
Я думаю, конечно, только можно сказать, это судьба, когда я здесь уже 8 лет. Но просто я была очень много страна в моей жизни. И было время, когда кто-то спросил меня, давай гулять в России 2 недели. 3 дня Москва, 3 дня Ленинград. Я приехала, я была 3 дня в Москве, и делала только все вещи как турист. И я чувствовала, как все турист в это время. Ой, это холодно, люди не рады, смотришь на улице, как все грустно. Я не буду вернуться в эту страну. Потом я была в Ленинграде. И в Ленинграде кто-то дал мне номер телефона Гребенщиков, сказал, Джана, ты рокер, тебе нужно звонить, мой самый хороший друг там, самый большой андерграунд рокер Гребенщиков. Я думала, что это должна быть шутка. В 1984 году я ни один американец может верить, что есть рок вот эта страна. Но я встретила, и всю мою жизнь перемен. Конечно, все, что я думала о этой стране, это было неправильно. И я просто начала быть вместе, и все вот это тусовка Ленинграда, где все музыкант, поэт, художник, все жить вместе, делать еще вместе. И для меня это просто было очень интересно, поэтому что-то случилось, и каждый раз я уехала, делала домой, я чувствовала, я должен вернуться. Я начала вернуться очень часто, и потом совсем здесь.
This is the story of Joanna Stingray, a girl from California who found herself in 1980s Russia on the radar of the KGB and FBI for smuggling out underground Soviet music that Americans were never supposed to hear. Yeah, this music. This is Russian underground rock that the Kremlin never wanted to be written or performed, and they definitely didn't want anyone in the West to be listening to it. Joanna Stingray spent most of the 80s in Leningrad with underground rock royalty, camera in hand. She filmed their music videos, their concerts, and even their drunken nights out. We're taking a deep dive into her video diaries from Russia as Joanna pulled open the Iron Curtain with an album called Red Wave.
Red Wave certainly was one of the first glimpses of Russian music around the world. We knew probably nothing about there even being rock bands that existed over there.
To the outsider, there wasn't real rock and roll in Russia. Everything had to go through the state or be approved by censors and the KGB. But rockers made it happen anyway.
They didn't like the way rock looked. I think they didn't like the way that it riled up the audience. I think they thought, like a lot of people did, that rock and roll led to rebellion and led to craziness.
I couldn't think of anything else but getting back into Russia.
A certain mop-haired guitarist probably had something to do with that. That's Yuri. Though he and Joanna didn't quite speak the same language, they soon made plans to marry. Young, crazy, and in love. But before that happy day, Joanna had work to do. Over the next 2 years, she skirted back and forth between LA and the USSR, carrying donated guitars and keyboards with her. And on every plane ride back, she left with recordings, lyrics, and music videos of Leningrad's top underground rock bands. She stuffed all this cultural contraband into the soles of her shoes and linings of her coats. Red Wave would soon become a hit in the US. Joanna set a wedding date and bought a dress. But then, of course, this happened.
And a telex came back from Moscow that said, Moscow is not expecting Joanna Stingray. It was a message sent from them that here's your payback for doing that record.
Joanna was labeled by the Soviet Union as an enemy of the state. She couldn't get back in to marry Yuri. She took her case to the national press.
It's gonna happen. Somehow we'll make it happen.
And sure enough, it did happen. Joanna's not entirely sure how, but she thinks her enemy status was revoked as an act of goodwill between America and Russia. And Gorbachev was supposedly a fan of rock music, and a copy of the album did make its way to his desk. So she returned to Leningrad, and Joanna and Yuri had their rock and roll, fairy tale, Russian wedding. Things changed really quickly after that. It was a time of perestroika and glasnost, change and openness. They used music to help crack open the USSR to the rest of the world. And ultimately, that made the Cold War just a little bit warmer.
Please give a warm welcome to Joanna Stingray, senior music producer, writer and artist, and Alexander Kan, London-based music critic, journalist, writer, broadcaster, and one of the leading experts in Soviet jazz and rock music. Joanna, first of all, congratulations on publishing of your amazing book. I think it's a superb recollection of your time in Soviet Union. I think it's really beautifully written, and it sort of covers the period when, from 1984, when you first went to the SSR, and goes to 1996, when you were in Moscow and you were pregnant with your daughter and you decided to go back to Los Angeles for good. And when I was reading this book, I had this feeling that you're writing a book or events that happened just yesterday. The amount of details about your life in Russia, the dialogue was so nuanced, and the spirit of your writing is so powerful, and there is a lot of enthusiasm and passion. When did you write it, and how long were you writing it? And also, we see on the cover, there's a Madison Stingray, your daughter's name. So what was her role in this book?
Я должен сказать, я чувствую, я должен говорить по-русски. I've done 6 presentations in
Your Russian is amazing.
And this is my first American one, so I feel like it's automatically I'm supposed to be speaking Russian. You know, I always had the idea that I wanted to write the book, but I'm not a writer. I can express myself, but as you'll see as I'm talking today, I can say a lot of information to get to my point. About 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to scan all my photos and make a website. Maybe it was 6 years ago now. And I knew the Russians would like it, but they completely were mesmerized. It was like the biggest thing. All the news programs were doing it because I didn't realize that my photos were a glimpse of the lifestyle and the time that has become so nostalgic and so important for Russians. You know, to me, it seems very equal to the way Americans always cherish the 60s. And they remember it and they want to know about those artists. That's how it was in Leningrad at the time. So after the website, I thought I'm going to write a book, and I tried to start doing it, and I hired a writer that just was not bringing the magic out of it. And I had begged my daughter, who's an incredible writer, for a couple of years to do it, and she was like, you know, sure, Mom, you did something in Russia. I'm not interested. But somehow we were in Europe in 2018, and she wanted to go to Leningrad. She had been there when she was 8 to visit her grandparents. And we went to Leningrad, and when she met Yuri and Vitya Sologub and Africa, she was totally taken by them. And then she missed meeting Boris. I had him for dinner with his wife because she went to the ballet, and she was so disappointed. And Boris said, before you go tomorrow and leave, run by with her. So I ran by quickly. He had just gotten up to his apartment, and he brings out tea the way they always do. They're so hospitable. And my daughter, he asked my daughter some question, and she said something like, you know, people can just be so mean in the world. And Boris said, you know, Madison, your life is like a play, and everybody in it is an actor, and if you don't like them, tell them to F off. And from there, for the next 90 minutes, my daughter and Boris are talking philosophy and life, and I see my daughter melting into him the way I did 35 years ago. It was so weird. And the minute we left, she said, where's those 3 chapters that guy wrote? She read it and said, this is awful, I can do better. And she took it away, and she was amazing because I would write the chapters and give them to her, and she would rewrite them. And every time I was like, oh my gosh, now you can feel it. And I kept thinking, this chapter's good, she's not gonna be able to change it. And she would still come back, and it would, you know, what I would write in 2 chapters, she would say in 2 sentences and convey it so nicely. So I'm so grateful for her that she was part of the book. She spent a lot of time looking at videos of my friends that have passed, and many of them are, and anybody here that are fans of the Russian rock know that half of them are gone. And she really fell in love with them, and she had a hard time because it made her so sad she could never meet Victor Tsoi or Sergei Korokin, because even through the video she could feel the magic. But anyway, I'm grateful to her, I'm grateful for the book coming out, and I do have to say, I have to point out my publisher, Carrie, who's sitting right here, because there are very few small independent publishers that look for people's voices around the world. And everybody has a story, and she seeks them out, and she somehow found me in my story, so I'm very grateful. And she has a ton of other books of stories of people all over the world. So it's Dapa House Press. I just have to put that out there.
Well, thank you. In 2024, it's going to be exactly 40 years since you went to the Soviet Union, and you got back to US and you smuggled music and you released this album that called exactly the same as your book, Red Wave. And you presented to the West, you exposed Soviet rock, and there were the most prominent bands at that time, which was Aquarium, Kino, Alisa, and Strange Games. Do you remember how and why you decided to do that? And also now, looking back at what happened, what were your hopes and dreams? What you thought is going to change?
You know, none of it was planned. I just went over there to actually clear my head, fell into this wonderland of craziness and artistic expression. It was so amazing. And so it changed everything, because I, like every American in 1984, never believed there could be rock and roll in Russia, good rock and roll. So when I saw it, I would come back and tell everybody, and they would laugh the way I did. Oh, there's no rock in Russia. So when I would start showing photos of the guys or start playing their music, people would be transformed the way I was. So I started to realize that I had a powerful tool. And the event that really forced me to focus on doing something concrete, doing the album, was I was at Disneyland, and there were a bunch of young boys in front of me, and I decided to ask them, what do you guys think of Russia? And without a thought, they said, we gotta blow them up. We hate the Russians. And I thought, if they could see the guys I'm hanging out with and see what they talk about and how they live their lives, they wouldn't feel that way. So that was kind of the impetus to get the album together. And again, everything I did in Russia wasn't really planned for any reason. It all just kind of unfolded and happened in the moment, which is part of what I really learned from my friends in Russia, to be in the moment, not always think of the end, just deal with the process and try to just enjoy life. And from that, all these things kind of happen. So I was just very happy that the album came out, that a lot of people here, if they didn't buy the album, they certainly saw the press was everywhere. So I was just grateful that I met those people and that I was lucky enough to do something to help them, you know?
Thank you. We just saw pictures of you and Alexander back in Leningrad, and it was 1984, and a recent photograph. And it's really amazing that you remain close friends and collaborators, you know, up to this time. Alexander, do you remember when the first time you met Joanna in Leningrad in 1984? What were your thoughts and impressions? And actually, what Joanna's presence in Leningrad meant to all of you at that time?
Well, we were getting people from the United States or from the West, from the UK or Germany coming over, and many of them were really impressed by the scene, because at the time when Joanna came, early 80s, this was probably the greatest period in the development of Russian rock, of Russian underground art. Things were going up and going up very rapidly, even though it was still very much in the underground, but still the rock club had been already founded. The events were getting more and more popular, and the scene was evolving and expanding very rapidly. So it was like a really intense and important time. So, but what made Joanna different from everybody else, and as I said, there were quite a few people, mostly young students coming over and being part of the scene, Joanna was probably the most dedicated of them all. Nobody had expressed so much enthusiasm and so much dedication to what they saw around, as much as we did. Even though, I must admit, Joanna will forgive me, that initially I was quite skeptical, because, you know, she was like, okay, an aspiring pop singer without probably, I mean, next to people like Boris Grebenshikov and Sergei Kuryakhin, who were profound intellectuals with a profound, deep knowledge of music and culture and everything. She was still a very young girl, but the enthusiasm and the dedication conquered me eventually, and quite quickly actually, especially after she, along with Boris, came up with this idea of making the album of Russian rock bands and publish it in the West. Because that I saw as an enormous breakthrough. Even when the idea came up, it seemed like it would be something revolutionary in terms of making the Soviet music, the Soviet underground music, which was really underground in the USSR. Okay, apart from the, whatever, maybe a few thousand people mostly in the capitals, in Leningrad or in Moscow. Okay, maybe the tapes were spreading through this system that was devised. It was called Magnit-Izdat, which was like, there was some Izdat, the books published by underground writers, and this was Magnit-Izdat, which the word comes from the word magnetophone, which is tape recorder. So the tapes were spreading all over the city, even though no records were officially published, but nevertheless the music of Aquarium and Kino was known pretty much all over the country. But still, it was known to a few select thousand of people. No coverage in the media, no access to recording studios, no nothing. And here there's this young girl who wants to make this music known all over the world. Of course we were enthusiastic, and of course I was fully supportive of her and was trying to help in every single way that I could.
And what was the impact of Red Wave album in USSR?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Of course, the impact was much bigger in the US or elsewhere in the world. Not only because of the music, but even though the music was great, but because it was made into a huge political event, which in fact it was. The underground music of the USSR breaking through into the West. And well, it was on the covers or in all the major news, not only in the rock magazines, not only in pop music magazines. It was, Joanna was on talk shows all over the country, or every major newspaper reviewed the album. So it was big event. And of course, it couldn't but be noticed in the West, in the Soviet Union. And people in the authorities, the powers that be, were literally shocked. How come? Who's this young woman who just makes this music, or these Russian bands who the authorities probably didn't even exist, didn't even suspect existed? And suddenly this music is in the New York Times, on CBS talk shows, in every major newspaper. So they were shocked, and initially their reaction, like knee-jerk reaction, was as much as it would be, for instance, with like Boris Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago would be published in the West in 1950s, or Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago would be published in the late 1960s or early 1970s. The knee-jerk reaction would be immediately denounce it, immediately say that this is like the CIA, or this is the subversive work against the Soviet Union. So that was the immediate reaction, and that was the tone of the first articles, that they realized that they couldn't suppress the story anymore. The story was too big in the West, so they had to react in some way. So initially their reaction was what it was, as I said, as I described it. And the way and the reason why Joanna was denied a visa to go to the USSR in 1987 to have this long-planned marriage with Yuri was precisely that. They were trying to suppress it. They were trying to sort of cut her off, the USSR, cut her off from the entire scene, to make her into the enemy of the state. But what is interesting, that it was a very serendipitous coincidence. It was happening at the time when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, when the country was geared toward reform, when what happened with the Chernobyl made the powers that be and Gorbachev primarily understand that suppressing information is not going to help you. And so they immediately realized that the way, not immediately, but very soon they realized that they would much better adapt it rather than confront it. So the result of the Red Wave album was that very soon, like literally within months of its release, the Soviet rock was legalized in the Soviet Union. That underground rock was actually let out of the underground and had become overground. It was not an easy process. It didn't happen overnight. There were all sorts of bureaucratic obstacles to that. But the process had begun, and it was really kicked off by Red Wave and Joanna Stingray.
Well, following the topic of changes, there is an opinion that Leningrad underground scene was so significant, and in a way, I mean, of course, we know that there were like musicians, performers, poets, and singers and filmmakers, and through their work, they were channeling the sort of the spirit, the freedom of ideas, and they were non-conformists, and in a way they prepared the society for all the changes and the perestroika and what happened in the 80s. And how was it for you, for a young American girl coming from a free society to the underground world of Russian arts and music?
Well, as Alex said earlier, when I first went there, I was young, I was very naive, and I really didn't understand life yet, or my life, and what I was here to be. So I was a perfect empty slate to fall into this, because the experience of what was going on was so visceral. I just could feel it throughout my body. I wasn't even sure what it was, but I was drawn to it. And you know, Boris Gurbanchkov was the first one I met, and he had what I call the light, and everybody would like to be near the light. So once I met him, I just wanted to be near him all the time. To me, it was fascinating that under communism, the streets looked the way that all Americans were showed at that time. But behind closed doors, I found them to be just like us. The way they would have conversations, the way they would laugh, the way they would dance, the way they would smoke pot. I mean, this was all happening. It was like a parallel society taking place next to communism. So to me, it was fascinating, and just everything about it pulled me into it. And, you know, I had thought that the word freedom meant how free you are in terms of the country you live in and the laws you abide by. So I thought, oh, here I come, this free American, and I'm sure they're going to be so envious. And what I learned really quickly is that they were freer than I was. And it really shook me to my core. And it was so incredible to see these people under this government living in a way where they express themselves fully, behind closed doors, of course, not on the street. But to me, the big lesson I think I learned, and I didn't realize this at the time, I learned this from writing all my books, that they taught me about the freedom of spirit. And the freedom of spirit is much more important than the freedom you're allowed to live in by the laws of your country. So for me, that's really what I think was the most important that I gained by it. I thought it just had an incredible creativity, and I was awed by the way Russians are true to who they are. You know, they didn't have, especially as a woman in America growing up in Los Angeles, where even in my day when I was younger, we're bombarded with the magazines, where the perfect sexy girl and all of this. And in Russia, I just was constantly awed by what I saw, as simple as at a party at night, some woman who was very heavy, wearing a tight dress, and completely dancing with freedom, not self-conscious at all. And going, my sister and I would go back and forth, and I'll never forget that one trip we went back, and maybe we'd gained a little weight, and somebody said to us in Russia, "Ah, ty tolsty," and they said, "Oh, you're thicker." And as an American, that's the most horrific thing, that somebody would notice and point out that you're heavier. And in Russia, they don't mean it in a mean way. They're so open about the way they live without any self-consciousness that I found that all so just, you know, enthralling. I just thought it was incredible.
Thank you. I would like to invite you to watch a second video, which is a segment from the documentary film Free to Rock that aired on PBS in 2017 and is narrated by Kiefer Sutherland. Video just about 5 minutes long.
In 1984, Joanna Stingray, a young singer from Beverly Hills, heard that Boris Grebenshchikov was a talented poet and rock musician. She decided to travel to Leningrad to seek him out.
10 seconds into his music, I totally understood that he was this magical artist. I really saw right away how important he was. His music was not released officially. It was not sold in any stores. This was all from word of mouth and from the copying of cassette tapes.
They formed a close friendship. Joanna Stingray became an intimate of many of the key figures of the underground rock scene that was emerging in Leningrad. She frequently brought instruments and recording equipment from the U.S. to her bohemian rocker friends in Russia, and she became the first American producer of Russian rock musicians.
Joanna was serving as an angel. She was providing us with everything, and the whole of Leningrad Rock Club, all the best bands were obliged to her because she would make life bearable. She was bringing like tape machines and guitars and strings and this and that, and everybody used that.
Stingray also befriended Victor Tsoi of Kino. She documented rare glimpses of a growing rock movement at a time when the government began softening its attitude about rock and roll.
When you were underground, you were not legally allowed to play music as your job and get paid for it. They were allowed to perform at the Leningrad Rock Club, which was a club that was established in Leningrad for these so-called unofficial bands, which is what the Soviet government liked to call them. The bands that I'd seen in Leningrad, they all had a different style. It was a very artistic time. It reminded me of America in the 60s. So to imagine that that's happening in a country under communism was unbelievable. But there was another level of kind of a game going on, because the KGB did have ties to the rock club. I think they believed that it was better to allow there to be a club or space where these underground bands could perform, that then they can keep an eye on them.
We encourage these clubs, but we use them as a source of information to weed out potential troublemakers, just to keep them under control and, in a sense, watch them so that they would not deviate further from that rock and roll. Because the organizers and managers of these clubs were KGB informers.
Joanna Stingray produced Red Wave, the first release of Soviet rock music in the United States.
The KGB, I knew that they were unhappy with Red Wave and other things. I remember telling Boris once, who told me the KGB was asking him all the time about me and trying to find out from him, is she a spy? And Boris trying to explain, no, she just loves our music. She wants to show the West our music. And I remember telling Boris, you know what, Boris, just tell them I want to come meet them. Just tell them I want to meet them. And the KGB headquarters in Leningrad was in what they called the big house. And I remember Boris coming back and saying, oh my gosh, I told them you want to meet them. And they all freaked out. No, no, don't tell her to come here.
You said to me, you consider yourselves as punks. Is that true?
Yes. I figured that in the modern world, it's the only way to express one's alienation from the world, from the life we lead.
The popularity of rock and roll had grown to the point where millions of teenagers had become fans of this forbidden music. These young people could not understand why their government wouldn't permit them to enjoy the music they loved.
Rock and roll was a way to express their views in criticizing the government, demanding change. These are the kinds of things that finally made an impression on Gorbachev, who brought about these desired changes within the Soviet Union.
Joanna, I wanted to ask about your father famously made this film, The Full Truth About Communism, in 1965, which was narrated by then Governor Ronald Reagan, as we saw in the clip. And his message to you after making this film was, Joanna, never go to the USSR. And now looking back at your life and your journey, what would be your message to your daughter?
Before I answer that, I just have to say the coolest thing. While this video is playing, every time the Russian music comes up, the tech guy behind the screen, who is not Russian and doesn't know it, was moving to the music. I'm just telling you, it proves how powerful it is. I was so happy to see this guy. You know, from a very early age, from about 4 or 5, and I saw my dad making this film in his office and cutting it, and he was so devoted to it. You know, it was constantly, don't ever go behind the Iron Curtain. Communism is evil. Of course, as a kid, when that's stuck in the back of your head, it always piques your interest as well. So I guess, did you ask what my advice to my daughter is? Yeah. So I guess my advice to my daughter would be go stand somewhere else, because this amazing quote by C.S. Lewis says, what you hear and see depends largely on where you're standing. So if I didn't go stand somewhere else and go to the Soviet Union, I wouldn't have experienced everything I experienced. So I think the lesson is, don't just listen to the rhetoric and listen to what the news says or people. Go search it out for yourself, and don't be afraid to go somewhere that might be scary, or that, you know, might be somewhere you were told not to go. I feel so blessed that I actually got there and met all of them. So,
yeah, thank you. I want to talk about, in your book, you're writing that David Bowie approached you at some point, and he was really interested to get rights on your life story, and he wanted to make a film, and he wanted to play Boris Grebenshchikov in it. And so how David Bowie knew about Leningrad underground scene, and was he involved in any way, and what happened to that offer?
You know, as Alex said, there were people from the West going into Russia before I got there, mostly from Europe, less from America. But a couple of weeks or so before I went there, there was some guy that was involved with Bowie in terms of business and brought back Bowie's cassette. And somehow Boris got word that Bowie had heard his music and was interested in helping. And so when I was leaving, all I could think about was getting back. So I said, I'm coming back, I'm coming back. And first Boris and Seba, who we met, his cello player, they rolled their eyes, because what Alex didn't mention when he said why I was different of everybody else that came back, there was really one difference. I came back. Everybody who met these guys fell in love with them, fell in love with the scene. Everyone said, we're going to come back, what do you need? You get back to your old life, your old jobs. Nobody returned. So they didn't believe I was going to come back, but I came back, and I came back, and I came back. So I think that's the real difference between me and everybody else. So long story short, I came back, contacted Bowie's office. He was interested in Boris. He asked what Boris needed. I said, when I asked Boris, right out of his mouth came Fender Stratocaster guitar. So lo and behold, next time I go back to Russia, I'm carrying a big hard case with a Fender Stratocaster, which the border guards were shocked what I was doing with this guitar. And when I'm nervous, I speak quickly, more quickly than I even speak normally. And I just started rambling. I'm a musician, I have to go to Paris after. And finally they let me in with it, but they wrote down every little detail of the guitar, the serial number, saying you have to bring it back. And I went and I took it to Boris. I became the hit in Leningrad. I met all these other rockers, and all they wanted to talk about was this guitar. It was the hero. And on the last day, I said to Boris, I'm sorry, I have to take the guitar back. I'll figure out how to. And he is so mellow, and he smokes a cigarette. Have some more tea, Joe. Have some more tea. And I said, I gotta go. I need the guitar. And in walks Africa and Timur, two of the artists, with the case. And I said, thank you, thank you. I'll bring it back, I promise. They opened the case, and there's my guitar. It looks exactly the same, but it's not. They made it. They painted it. They put the serial number, and off I went with that, and they kept the guitar. So anyway, that was the first experience with Bowie, and he was very interested. And I first took Boris's music out and was going to try to put an album out of just Boris, and Bowie was going to help. But in the end, I thought it's the first glimpse Americans will get of Russian rock. Maybe I should give more than one band. And that's why I ended up doing the 4. And he was really supportive. I don't think he ended up doing anything on the album, but we continued to be in contact. And we started coming up with ideas. He wanted to play in Russia and have Boris open for him. He wanted to bring Boris to the States. I ended up later on putting out a Tin Machine album, which was one of his bands. So we really started kind of collaborating. He was completely into the whole underground scene. He thought it was fabulous.
And what happened to the film? Never happened.
Well, no, what happened to the film, a typical LA story, is that I got a call. Now, a little backstory. I don't want to talk too long, but a little backstory. When I was younger, the only rocker I was ever a fan of was Bowie. I loved Bowie, and I went to his concerts, and I would drool like everybody else. And so one day, Bowie's manager calls me and says, if you're in LA, David would like to meet you. And I said, what? And he said, he'd like to meet you. So we met at this hotel in Westwood, and I come in, and he's sitting on a chair with his legs up, so relaxed. And I just kept saying in my head, don't jump on him, don't jump on him. just act normal. So I just said hi, and he started to tell me how he wanted to buy my life story. And then he spent about 20 minutes explaining to me who he is, that he's a producer, and he's trying to kind of sell himself to me in the sweetest way. And I'm just sitting there like, don't start crying, just listen to him. And so anyway, at the end he left. He was such a normal person. He was incredible. And he left. His manager came and said he wants to offer you $35,000 to buy your life story. We know it's not a lot. Think about it. Get back to us. And of course, I'm like, yes, I'm going to make a movie with Bowie. And of course, when I told my parents and my friends, and we all grew up here, everybody says, no, you can't do that. You have to get an agent. They'll pitch you to all the producers. You'll get much more money. Biggest mistake of my life. But anyway, it was fun to meet him, and he was so supportive of all the Russian rockers.
Well, thank you. Alexander, my question to you as a music critic, and also you were there in Leningrad at the time of Rock Club. I want to talk about founding of the Rock Club, because rock bands, they were not really political by themselves, but KGB raids on the concerts were quite common. And in a really strange way, KGB decided to set up Leningrad Rock Club to control this underground thinking. And there was like 600-seat theater where rock bands can be seen and watched by Soviet people. Do you call this music unofficial?
Well, it's an interesting question. What was happening at the time, at the very late 70s and the very early 80s, was that the underground culture, which rock music was just one of the segments of, there was also underground writers and poets and critics who had their gatherings at various places and apartments and readings, and they published their samizdat magazines. There were visual artists who staged makeshift shows in apartments or in the parks, which were raided by the police, and then the organizers would be arrested and the crowds would be dispersed. And of course rock music, which was probably the most vocal and the loudest and the most obnoxious for the authorities, where all these so-called underground sessions were organized, raided by the police. People who organized them were arrested. And so this was like a constant growing pressure from all this underground art upon the authorities, upon the establishment. And they realized that there was something they had to do to somehow tame the whole movement. And with the 1980 Olympics coming up, they thought up this experiment that consisted in creating these kind of reservations, semi-official reservations for all this underground art, for all this underground culture. So the writers were given something which was called Club 81, because it was in 1981, which was a tiny but extremely cozy, beautiful place in the Dostoevsky Museum in Leningrad. Well, Dostoevsky, of course, the hero and everything. The artists were allowed to form something which was called the Association for Experimental Art, and they would be given venues in different palaces of culture, different places there where they could exhibit their art. And the rock musicians were allowed to form this rock club. All of that was, you ask whether it was unofficial, it was semi-official. All of these things were allowed, but no access to the media, no access to the recording studios, no way they could sell their art, or the musicians or the organizers could sell their ticket, so that the artists would be paid for their work in no way. So it was kind of a loud reservation. And the rock club was just one of those three. The reason that Leningrad was chosen rather than Moscow was because it was a bit further away from the officialdom, and also because the pressure from the Leningrad underground scene was probably even stronger than that of Moscow. So somehow it happened, and so it was this very peculiar way. Nobody could, of course, have predicted how it will grow, but it grew enormously in the early 80s, and by the time that when Joanna released her Red Wave album, it had become a huge, huge movement, and so it had to be legalized.
Thank you. And Joanna, you were traveling between two countries during the time of Cold War. Of course, you got an attention of secret services, FBI and KGB, as we just listened in the videos. What were your interactions with secret services? In the book, you presenting some of the files from your FBI profile. I assume your KGB archive still remains closed. So can you tell us about your experiences? And also, Alexander, for you, if you had any stories about KGB, maybe you can tell after.
What I found fascinating about my experience with the FBI and the KGB is that, to me, it seemed like they were schooled at the same exact university. The way they both tried to speak to me and meet me was a circuitous way, which was so bizarre. They were so alike in so many ways. It was really fascinating. And, you know, the FBI, if they would have called me, so both sides thought I was a spy because it was, of course, a red flag, an American girl in 1984 going every 3 months back and forth to Russia. So I get that. But all the FBI had to do was call me and say, we need to come meet you, we want to know if you're a spy. But they don't do that. So what happened was, one day, I guess I was running around and my mom said, oh, can you come over? And I ran over to my mom's house. And I walked in and say, hey, Mom, what's going on? And I see this woman sitting there with my mom. And my mom says, oh, this is Betsy so-and-so from the FBI. And I've been talking to her, and I literally almost fainted. And my mom says, oh, yeah, she was talking about your dad's documentary, but now we're talking about you. And the woman said, I'd love for you to sit down and talk to me about what you're doing in Russia. And then goes on the questioning, which is almost word to word how the KGB questioned me. And later I said to my mom, why would you let the FBI come? And my biggest fear was that I was sure that the KGB was watching me. And the last thing I wanted was to get my visa declined because my whole life was in Russia and going back and helping these guys. So the thought of me being in a house with the FBI was horrific, that now I was going to get my visa declined because they think I'm a spy because I'm meeting with the FBI. And my mom says that they called her and said, you know, we wanted to ask you some question about your first husband's film, Truth About Communism. My mother's been remarried for over 10 years at that point. My mother's been divorced for 20 years from my father, And my father is alive and lives 45 minutes away. So why do they need to call my mother for this? I got so mad at my mother, and she said, of course, well, maybe this is a sign. You're doing something dangerous and you shouldn't go back anymore, which you don't tell to somebody who's so passionate. You know, I become like a missionary. But the same thing, the KGB. So what's interesting about what was going on in Leningrad is one day Boris said to me, oh, I talked to the KGB yesterday, so nonchalantly. And I said, what do you mean you talked to the KGB? And he said, yeah, the KGB calls all the rockers once in a while and they want to meet us. You know, Kinshev's runs to Moscow, you know, so-and-so says F you and hangs up the phone, you know, and then some will meet them. And Boris said, I have nothing to hide, so I go down to these meetings. And I was so shocked by this. But then I realized when Boris was telling me about these meetings, that when you're telling your truth and you know what you're doing is pure, you're not afraid. So Boris would go down and they would ask him questions, he would answer, and then he would tell me how a lot of the KGB agents, when the meeting was over, would ask him for autographs. Can you autograph this? I mean, it was such a bizarre thing. So that's why I said, well, my truth is all for good. Yes, I'm taking the music out illegally, but I'm doing it to show Americans how we have this connection, how they're similar to us. So that's why I asked Boris to take me down there. And when he said they were so freaked out about meeting me, then the next trip, Boris said to me that these two philosophy professors from the university who wanted to meet me, and it's up to me, do I want to meet them? And I could tell by the way Boris said it, oh, these must be KGB. And I'd already been approached by the FBI, so this whole game of going around. So they made a meeting at the Evropeyskaya Hotel right off Nevsky Prospect. And so I was so sure that it was the KGB, and I was so nervous, but I thought, you know, I'm just going to say my truth. And I come in, and these two guys are there, and they're kind of disheveled. And the KGB I knew from the rock club are, you know, very tidy and in suits. Unfortunately, so are some of the poets and intelligentsia. So I always thought they were all KGB, and some of them weren't. But these guys were disheveled, so I thought that I made it all up in my head, and that these were not the KGB. And they said to me, we have a room on the second floor just so we have more comfortable to talk. And this, again, was in about 1986, so still communism. Gorbachev was just starting to do his stuff. And they take me upstairs, and they open this door, and there's this huge table with the finest china and champagne and vodka and fish. And I thought, this is not professors. Oh, boy. So, again, this same questioning. So what Americans like to do on the weekend, because they're the professors of you know, sociology, and I'd answer. And then all of a sudden the question, the same as the FBI, but the reverse. So do you ever meet any Russian immigrants? Have you met any Russians from the consulates? And the weird thing is that they know, I know that they're spies, and they know that I know that they know I'm a spy, but nobody says anything. It's just this game. I mean, it's so weird. And then the second time I had to meet the FBI, I met at Hamburger Hamlet up on Doheny Road, which I'm sure everybody in town went to, on the sticky tables. And the Red Wave album was coming out. And I brought the album cover. The album cover was ready. And she again started asking me these questions. And I said, I told you last time, it's about music. I love music. I don't know anything political. And I said, look, here's the album. This is what I'm doing. And she looked it all over. And I was so frustrated by her because neither of them listen. When they have the red flag, you're a spy, they just don't see any other scenario. She looks at the album and says, okay, can I take this? And I said, no, it'll be in Tower Records in a week. You can go buy it. I was so mad at this woman. And then I thought I got rid of her. And then when I got my files, I realized a year later, they were still reporting on me about how I had my visa declined and everything. So anyway, there's my story.
But now, like so many years have passed, do you know who was behind, you know, when your visa was declined, who was behind it and why it happened?
You know, this has been a big question, and I had to write the book, and it took me a long time, and the bottom line is, I actually know who did it. I always knew who did it, but my standard line has been, I don't know who did it because what does it matter? My life was ruined for 7 months anyway. I can't get my time back. And any Russians that live here know, no matter how Russia changes and is what it is, there's lines you never want to cross, and it doesn't do me any good to say who did it. It was 3 people that signed against me that were in Moscow. But the rumor is, which is basically true, that it was actually official bands in Moscow that were so jealous that I put out the underground bands in America before it was their territory. They were the big Russian rock and rollers, so that's the rumor that it's some of them.
Interesting. It sounds like a film or a script. Alexander, do you have any stories, interesting stories that you want to share with us about your interactions with KGB?
Well, it's interesting that when I was telling you about the way or how Rock Club and those other organizations for underground art started, it's just a sign that in a paradoxical way, the KGB were probably, within the Soviet establishment, they probably were the most advanced and the most progressive, no matter how ironic and wild it may sound to you now, they were the most progressive and the most advanced in their understanding of the situation, or certainly much more advanced and much more progressive in their understanding of the situation than, say, the party bureaucracy. The party bureaucracy was still very much enshrined in the dogmas, enshrined in all these bureaucratic dogmas that they had to observe. And the KGB, seeing how the society was changing rapidly, they understood that the things that they had to give way, at least in one way or another. I was approached by KGB on a number of times. And again, I was never sort of summoned officially into their headquarters or something. Those would be meetings set up in, I don't know, in a children's community center, where they would have a room and they would invite me. I was teaching at the time. And they would sort of innocuously start asking me about the situation in my school, which was an art school where I was teaching. And then at one point, they caught me up and showed me a letter that I had written to my university friend, in which I confided in him of my experience of reading Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago and some other subversive underground literature. And they said, okay, well, this is a crime. Who gave you these books? I said, well, I'm not going to tell you. Did you give them to anybody? No, I didn't. Reading these books, they tell me, is not a crime, but spreading them, giving them to others to read, is a crime. So whoever gave them to you committed a crime, and you, by not disclosing them, you are pretty much covering for a criminal. So they started blackmailing me. And listen, this is the most interesting part of this story. By that time, all these unofficial or semi-official organizations had already been created, and they had their KGB curators, who of course knew what we were doing, and who were of course much more knowledgeable and tolerant of what we were doing. So I'm calling a curator and said, and I tell him, look, what do they want from me? Okay, I read Solzhenitsyn and I read this Continent magazine. We're all reading this. You all know what we are doing. What do they want from me? And he's telling me, oh, Mr. Kan, sorry, we'll settle it out. And it was gone immediately. And no pressure for me afterwards.
I have to tell one story after this. So I've been doing these books in Russia. Besides my 2 written books, I do these photo books that have documents, and I tell stories with them. And when we were in Russia in the 80s, people would always say, oh, be careful, that guy's a KGB informant, or that guy's KGB. You just never know. It was always about the informers. And I remember this one guy that we thought was. And as I'm doing these photo books, and Alex helps me by translating them all, I started to see this guy. And he's at the concert, and then he's at my wedding. And I kept calling Alex. I said, Alex, this is that guy. I'm sure he's KGB, and we don't know who he is. But you just never know. It's such a weird world to be living in.
Yeah.
I'd like to invite you to watch last video. It's going to be a trailer by the Russian filmmaker Andrei Arapetov, who is trying to find funding to make a documentary on Joanna Stingray with all her archival footage. Video just about 3 minutes long.
special report on the new wave of really red rockers.
Red wave.
Joanna Stingray's adventures in the USSR read like a Hollywood script that never got made into a movie.
No, she's funny.
Starring a girl from a good American family who finished Beverly Hills High School and recorded a mini album. Her mom had been Miss New York and taken part in the movie Some Like It Hot with Marilyn Monroe. Joanna's dad had made an anti-communist propaganda film narrated by Ronald Reagan.
Less than 50 years after the communists seized power in Russia.
But then, with the Cold War going strong, this American girl decided to fly to Leningrad.
Пожалуйста, где Невский проспект? Прямо.
She started hanging out with underground rock bands and artists and became a participant in the Leningrad Rock Revolution.
Those who love the stage just stay in the night. Rock and roll's dead and
She fell in love with the Soviet Union and visited it again and again, and she came bearing gifts.
You want?
She asked David Bowie for an electric guitar for her friend Boris Grebenshchikov. She brought Andy Warhol's blessings and autographs for underground artists in Leningrad. And she got Yamaha to give the latest gear to the Leningrad Rock Club, Kino and Sergei Koryohin.
Okay, I'm gonna give you Victor Tsoi, and he's the lead singer of Kino.
Hello, I'm okay, how are you?
Then the tourist became a smuggler, bringing records from the Leningrad underground back to the States. She released them on a split double album called Red Wave.
Russian rock and roll. Russian rockers.
To support the album, she filmed interviews, concerts and the first Soviet music videos for MTV using her own camera.
You are ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Coincidentally, just after Joanna sent copies of the compilation to Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, calling for an end to the Cold War, relations between the two superpowers actually began to warm up. Still, neither the KGB nor the CIA could believe that Joanna was doing it all out of love of the music and the people playing it.
come together right now over me.
During Perestroika, Joanna became a Greenpeace ambassador, as well as Russian rock legend.
Земля – это наш дом. Не надо мусорить. Да?
Да!
David Bowie was so impressed by Joanna's story that he even wanted to make it into a movie and play Boris Grebenshchikov in it. In the late 90s, Joanna Stingray went back to the States and almost forgot about her 12 years in Russia. But she recently published a book about her adventures in the Soviet Union and again began traveling regularly to Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Вазона давайте, уходите. Нехорошо. У себя, наверное, так не делаете.
I will ask you quickly one question that I cannot not ask, and then we'll open the floor for the questions from the audience. All your footage, you're surrounded by musicians and artists, and they're all men. Were there any female performers? And did you have any female friends? And
you know, in my first interview of Boris, I started interviewing him from the first trip because I just found him so fascinating. I said, "Are there any female rockers?" And he said, "No, unfortunately, we're a little old-fashioned in Russia, and there weren't." But for me, it was like a kid in a candy store. I was hanging out with the guys all night. You know, I only saw the wives when there were these official parties. But the rest of the time, it was tusovka, which is my favorite Russian word, which means spending a lot of time doing nothing. It was me and the guys. First with Grebenshchikov, Kurokin, and Alex, and then with Kino. So there really wasn't. There was this great performance artist in Moscow, Joanna Arguzara, that was kind of like a performance artist. She was amazing, but there really weren't any female rockers.
Thank you. Is anyone have a question? It's time to, yeah. Thank you, James.
Do you have a question here, my friend? Yes, absolutely.
А я могу по-русски говорить?
Можно.
Здравствуйте, Джоанна. Еще
Здравствуй.
раз. Мы последний раз с вами виделись на презентации книги «Подлинная история русского рока» 11 мая в Доме книги в Москве.
Класс,
Мне
да-да-да.
посчастливилось второй раз вас увидеть за 1 год.
Ага.
Вот, у меня вопрос такой назрел. В связи с тем, что сейчас отношения России и Америки немного откатились вот в то время, когда вы к нам привезли все то, что мы имеем сегодня, да, благодаря вам. И вопрос такой вот возник. А вот реально музыкантов российских сюда привезти? Еще же много кто с нами остался. Это Кинчев, это Тихомиров, Каспарян, другие группы, которые участники ленинградского андеграунда. И здесь какой-то концерт памяти Соя сделать, либо просто какой-то фестиваль вот в Америке.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Olya, say it.
Okay.
Say the question.
Yeah, the quick question. If so many artists are still performing from the ones from your time in Leningrad, and is it possible to bring them over here to Los Angeles and to organize a concert dedicated to Victor Tsoi?
You know, it's Victor Tsoi's, it would have been his 60th birthday this June, so there's a lot of celebrations in Russia. I have a new photo book coming out in Russia in 2 weeks for him. And a lot of the bands haven't come over here. You know, Boris lives in London now, so he's in Europe a lot. But there is going to be a huge event called Soy Fest at the University of Rochester. Outside of Buffalo, or in Buffalo, New York, that was supposed to be 2 years ago for COVID, and it's this upcoming September, and supposedly they're going to bring Rashid Nugmanov, the director of Victor's film, Yuri Kasparian, who was my first husband, the guitar player in Kino, and Sasha Tsoi, Victor's son. But there was just a huge retrospective exhibit in Moscow, in Manege, 14 rooms all about Victor, and I gave them all of my archives, and so a lot of stuff is going on. I don't know, again, if any of them are going to come play here. It would be amazing, though.